So we're going to cover Microsoft Power Platform. So before I start, does any hands up anyone who's heard of the Power Platform by Microsoft? Yeah, good. So I'm Dave Vaughton. I'm a data platform analytics consultant at Grey Matter, but I also cover Power Platform products as well. So, Power Platform. So this is the Microsoft slide, and I'm not going to do too many of these. So it's one connected platform that empowers everybody to innovate. So typically, this is aimed at what I would call the power user, what's the American term? The power citizen. However, for the ISV proposition, it's developed to a point where you can utilize this as an ISV proposition as well as enabling development with your own organization. So it's got building web and mobile applications, data insight, and built-in enterprise security, governance and management. So away with the marketing stuff. So we'll go through these products. So I'm pretty sure all of you have heard of PowerBI, yeah? Have you all used it? Or hands up of anyone who's used PowerBI? Good. What about PowerApps? Yeah, okay. And then Flow, or the kind of Azure equivalent, yeah, LogicApps, okay. So Power Platform broadly is describing these three products working in conjunction to deliver the solutions that I was just talking about. However, they're inherently integrated into Dynamics 365, Office 365, and relatively easily into any standalone application. Also, they're underpinned, especially Dynamics, by the Common Data Service. Have any of you used the Common Data Service yet? Cool. So I'll comment what the Common Data Service is in a bit. And then they all really can then leverage the power of Azure. So if you can't achieve what you need to do within the Power Platform, you can then fall back to your kind of traditional model of developing an application using Azure resources and so on. So I'll start with Power BI. Lots of people have used it. So really, Power BI was 3 years ago, really started to gain some traction in the market for analytics. It's my personal favorite product that Microsoft do now. It's overtaken Visual Studio. The rate of development is huge. I struggle personally to keep up the features on a monthly basis. It is literally the fastest developed product I've seen. But really, what it's doing is allowing you to display data through dashboards and reports, whether it's on desktop or on mobile, or embedded, which I'll come on to later, to enable your users or your customers to then take decisions based on some insight from the data. They say create ad hoc analysis, and I'll come on to why I have a big caveat on that in a bit. But using Power BI enables you to do a lot of the things that would be really difficult before. So if you take, for example, Tableau or ClickView or some of the other products, in the visualization layer, maybe especially Tableau actually still has Power BI kind of on the back foot. But really where it comes into its own is what is under the hood in Power BI. So it allows you to do, I'll go on to my next slide. Yeah. So it enables you to, I've got the wrong presentation. So yeah, underneath you have data modeling, and you have M and DAX. So if you've used Power BI, as a standalone product, you can do an awful lot of work that you would do without needing an ETL developer, a data warehouse, which you would need in the traditional stack. So you can extract data, manipulate it, build it into a data model, build your report on top of it and then distribute that within your organization or to your customers or within another solution. That is the real differentiator between Power BI and the competing platforms, is that is built in behind it. And underneath this, this is a slide I steal from my data platform presentation. So Power BI, really, it's built on the same technology as Power Pivot, which you might have used some time ago, possibly. An analysis services on premise, so SQL Server Analysis Service, the tabular one, or Azure Analysis Service. It's a common technology underneath, which is really important to understand, because if you reach the point where you need to scale Power BI, you have the options of maybe using premium, but you could use analysis services, or you could do Azure Analysis Services. And understand that it's the common technology. They're pretty interchangeable. There are some quirks of moving between different ways, but really it is underpinning the same tabular reporting technology, which is in memory. So the reason I display this slide is Power Platform gets you so far, but you do need to have an awareness of what's underneath should you start dealing with more data. So for example, if you were going maybe over like 20 million rows of data, you would want to arrange that into a data mart rather than just ingest it into Power BI every time. So for example, that's following this kind of Kimball methodology. So for anybody who's done BI, they'll be aware of the Kimball methodology. And then that would be creating the star schema or the snowflake schema, arranging your data through ETL. So Power BI can do that through mQuery, and you can then use DAX to create the measures for the report. However, as a solution gets more complex, you're going to need to use the more traditional BI stacks, so whether that's SSIS or Data Factory or your preferred ETL technology. You would then need to use that to build that into a solution there to use. It really is, I'm trying to think the right, it's the testing it in Power BI in its desktop form and in the Power BI service. You can do 90% of all things you need to do. It is when you hit that performance thing where you get the spinning wheel, where you need to start understanding of what's behind this technology and then what are the next steps you need to take, rather than go, this can't do it for me anymore. So something that's really useful in Power BI in terms of a kind of ISV proposition is you can now distribute these reports in quite a different way. So you could resell, for example, Power BI solution to your customer. You could do an embedded one within your application, or you can use Azure B2B. Has anybody used Azure B2B to share anything with their customer or anything? So that's a really important way, and I'll just show you an example of that. So this is something that we distribute to our CSP customers. So this is just I'm not going to go through all of the report, it's not the important part, but it is just a Power BI report, essentially, that is then published in our own tenant, which we then use Azure B2B to connect to another customer's tenant. Once they're authorized, they can then access all of the content and the row level security. I'm not going to go into the kind of row level security, but they can then filter their data and all the security comes across. So when I go back to the slide, I'm just going to load a different slide. Well, apologies for a moment. So while that's, I'm just loading that up. So the reason I mention it is Azure B2B is a really good way of sharing things. So right now, when I come to PowerApps, that's not a feature, but it is coming. Sorry about this. Right, there you go. So the management and control. So all identity is managed through the Azure Active Directory. So anything that you would be used to managing within your own Office 365 tenant, you can then use that through Azure B2B and manage the security to that application. It then also gives you access to all the audit logs, which when I come on to Dynamics and so on is really important. And it gives you a way of centrally managing everything. So if I just drop down. There we go. Right, that's the slide I needed. So the Power Pivot, a common technology, self-service. Any of you who've tried it will realise that really it's something that you should have somebody build for you the data model, and then you can use self-service on top of it. Building a data model is a relatively specialised skill. I wouldn't recommend you just give open access to everybody to Power BI within your company. You'll end up with the same problems you get with Excel, where people just make things, bad things happen, you get misinterpretations of data, and they end up saving them all over the place, and exactly the same carnage can happen, with the added danger that if you, it can hold an awful lot more data, so you can hold 500 million rows easily, so you could lose all of the data very easily. I'll go on to embedded in a moment. That was the slide. So in terms of Power BI, how it's licensed, so for majority of organizations they use Pro. Premium is diverging from Pro, so historically Premium was just a way of Microsoft doing a kind of organization-wide license. However, Premium is starting to diverge and the value-added features are being added into Premium. So, for example, Premium would license your whole organization. And if I go back to what I was saying for Azure B2B, if you used Premium, anybody who connects to your Power BI app is then licensed to view that app. Whereas if you didn't, they would need a Pro license to view that app, which you don't really want to manage that headache. You don't want to have to make sure they've bought a license or provision them a license. It's got a dedicated compute and storage. So really, if you're going above about a gigabyte in a Power BI file, you're going to start to think about needing dedicated compute. That's typically where the free resource will run out. On a good data model, that's around 35 million records in a fact table, just to give you a kind of benchmark of where you'd start to hit that problem. I wouldn't recommend it, but it gives you the on-premise for licensing for Power BI. If you had a customer who's, I don't know, defense, where they have a closed network, but they still want to use Power BI, you could create a solution for there. They put it on a server. It's effectively analysis services enterprise on SQL Server, and they could consume the reports internally without being connected to the internet. That's one of only two ways of getting it. The other way is SQL Server with software assurance, which is really expensive. Incremental refresh, that's really important if you have large data sets that you don't want to keep reloading. So imagine you've got 10 gigabytes, you don't want to every 30 minutes upload 10 gigabytes to a cloud service, you only want to upload the differences. And the other part would be paginated reports. So most of you are going to have some exposure to SSRS in some respect. So this is the way that you would move that workload away from a dedicated SSRS server, and you could then move that into a Power BI where it's then controlled in the same experience. So you've got the Power BI dashboards, the slice and dice, and you've got the paginated reports. What's the other highlights in here that are 100 terabytes of storage. Sorry.
So with the SSRS
sorry, can you just say the last bit again?
Sort of like a letter which has got some data in, or like a report that's needed. Rather than sort of slice and dice.
Yes, that's exactly it. So I believe it's from version 2016 onwards in compatibility. So that's an important part if you've got some legacy SSRS. But it is, in Premium, you're allocating part of your dedicated resource to providing effectively an SSRS server that's right next to Power BI. It looks like a similar environment, and it's in the software as a service area. But really, under the hood, they're just providing that capability right next to Power BI. It's not integrated with Power BI. You're just using the compute and memory to provision SSRS. So it's exactly the same. So if you've already got SSRS and you have Premium, you can just put that in that service.
But you don't need a server to put it on?
No server at all. So that you're in fact, I'll just go to the next slide. Let me explain it. So in Premium and embedded, effectively what you're doing is just renting these types of machines, which are very similar to kind of Azure VMs. So they're the kind of resources that you get dedicated behind it. And for SSRS, you then select how much of that resource you want to dedicate to SSRS, and the rest is free for Power BI resources to use. SSRS doesn't work on embedded SKUs. Does that answer the question? So you kind of are renting renting the hardware, but you just don't see it because it's under the software as a service SKU. Something that I really like about Premium, so depending how current data needs to be, on an automatic refresh, Pro only enables you to do it 8 times a day. So if you imagine you have a sales environment, 8 times a day isn't great. 48 times a day is pretty good, and if you need more than that, there are other approaches you could use. So you can use a kind of direct query, which is as the database is there, but be aware when you do that, the workload is then going on to the SQL server every time somebody's slicing and dicing through that. So if you get tempted into the direct query area, be aware whichever resource, whether it's in Azure or on premise, that server is going to hit all the load of those queries. So if you've got a kind of select star Power BI view, it's going to hit that SQL server very hard. And really, if you do have the kind of price justification for it, it can also, the dedicated compute can be used for embedded solutions as well. So if you imagine the scenario where you have your internal use, you have some stuff that you share with Azure B2B, but you also have an embedded application. So you've got your bespoke application and you want to put Power BI within it. You can assign the compute from Power BI Premium to that application, so it kind of covers every scenario. It is expensive though, so you've got to speak with us or somebody who can then price up which is the best method, but as a kind of all-inclusive product, Premium is very good, but it is about £3,500 a month-ish, depending on what discounts we can provide. But it's an expensive thing, but if you imagine under the hood, effectively you're buying SQL Server Enterprise with SA, with dedicated resource and 100 terabytes of storage, it isn't that bad, and licensing your entire company for Power BI Pro. We kind of went over this slide, but so embedded is important to understand. So embedded can only be used for licensing outside of your organization, and you build it within your application, and it's the same model as Premium. You're buying dedicated resource to do that. All of these things, the kind of cost does jump up quite a lot. So when I was saying going back like 5 steps, is building the correct data model makes it very efficient. So if you take, for example, the little demo I showed you of the Azure cost management we did, if we just took the raw data and applied our pricing to it to display to our customers, the model size was 10 gigabytes. If you do, which on here, you're looking at one of the higher SKUs on here, at least a P1, it wouldn't work in the normal service. If you do that modeling, it's now 600 megabytes as a model in the Power BI service. So it's a really important thing to consider if you have a reasonably large data set, is to do the data modeling, because you will then have this impact of the resource cost here. And whether you use premium, you could use analysis services, which is an Azure one, which is effectively the same price as Power BI embedded as a product. But all of those things you want to avoid, because as all of your data will grow, that cost will grow. So having nailed that, you really do mitigate your future cost. I can't labour that enough. If you do have data, like I've had a lot of conversations where customers are suddenly spending an awful lot of money because they haven't done the data model. So take, for example, I've taken all the entities out of CRM, I just stitched them together with their keys, I've done a report, now there's 10 terabytes of data in the CRM, now my Power BI report is almost unresponsive and is costing a huge amount of money to provision. That's a worst case scenario, you wouldn't do that, but I think it makes the point. So, to move on to PowerApps, so PowerApps really came about a while ago when Microsoft were doing the kind of push for mobile, and you'll all know that that's kind of died as Microsoft doing mobile. And probably about 18 months, 2 years ago, it's kind of been relit underneath. So they've suddenly started developing at not quite the pace, but not far off the pace of Power BI. What it allows you to do is create apps really quickly that can be shared within your organization currently. So you cannot share this through Azure B2B right now, but so it's a kind of very, if I put it in the old world, it's the kind of people who would have made like an Access or an InfoPath or a SharePoint app to solve a business problem. It's very much in that space, although it gives you a lot richer experience in that it automatically works on a mobile, it's secure, it connects to all the rest of the Office 365. The bit I really like is PowerApps and Power BI are interchangeable. So you can put Power BI data within PowerApps and have the analysis of that within the Power BI service, or you can build a Power App within put a Power App within a Power BI app. So the biggest problem I have with Power BI is you can't write back. So we did a small project in our company where we had a department who basically needed to write back to a table and update some data. But it was a big table and they needed a filtering capability of Power BI. So we put a Power App within the Power BI app, they select the record that they're interested in, and they can then make the change there in the single place without having to create a new app itself. So instead of taking our dev guys maybe a couple of weeks to make a little app that's working off a couple of tables, it took 3 days in Power BI and PowerApps, including the learning of how to do PowerApps and stitching into Power BI. So it's just to give you a kind of real world example of the productivity gain you can get if that technology fits.
Was that
Sorry?
single value or multiple values that could update?
Multiple values. You kind of have the kind of typical application environment where you could select multiple values. From Power BI, you've got to make sure you're selecting it in the right way. So if you're aggregating by a category of something, you're enabling the user to select that category, which would then reveal the category within the Power BI, filter the Power BI by the selection in Power BI, and then you can have I don't know, update status to closed, for example, and you could click that button and just go ahead and do that.
Does PowerApps work offline?
No. Yes. Well, technically yes, but I wouldn't go anywhere near. I wouldn't really just assume it has to be online all the time. That you can make it work offline. Don't do it at the moment until they have a feature for it. And I think really the reason for it is it's assuming a constant connection to all of the Microsoft Cloud software as a service stack. So on the connectivity front, and this kind of applies for Power BI as well, the bit that really helps you do something quickly is there are so many built-in connections for Power BI and PowerApps. And then if you don't have it, it's pretty easy just to consume a web API in both of those technologies. And the bit that, I mean, we suffer from this, so we're in a hybrid scenario. So I'm guessing lots of you guys aren't all cloud, you've got hybrid, or you're just on-prem right now. So with a Azure Data Gateway, there are a few features that aren't available, but broadly speaking, within Azure Data Gateway, you can interact with a on-premise database with Power BI and PowerApps exactly like you would if it was an Azure hosted database. If you ever need any advice on setting up Azure Data Gateways, please reach out. There's kind of some best practice, some things to watch out for. Basically, if you do it wrong and you break it, everything that's attached to it on top breaks as well. But if you ever do need to put an Azure Data Gateway in, please contact Grey Matter and we can help you out. It's only a 15-minute run through, but it will save you a lot of heartache. I found out the hard way. I broke one, and it's not nice. And you can also build a custom connector. For Power BI, you can also monetize that, which is an interesting one. So you can publish it and make money out of a custom connector on Power BI. That's not there for PowerApps right now. So you might just say, I've got some IP where I want to build a custom connector to a solution that is not supported by Microsoft. You can then charge for that. So if you speak to Chris, he can inform you how you set that up in the marketplace and so on, but I thought that was really interesting. If you've got some unique IP about some, I don't know, fringe ERP system that Microsoft will never build a connector for, you could then leverage that and just sell the connector without building any kind of other solution on top. And this is, normally someone shouted at me by this point about this. It does not replace proper software development. It is purely there as a way of accelerating it, and it's getting closer and is more acceptable to use, but it definitely doesn't replace using Visual Studio. And if you're using Xamarin for mobile, it really is the kind of power user versus professional developer, and you should never really assume, unless it really fits your model, to replace your classic Visual Studio app development with a Power App. If it solves your business need, go for it. But you've got to bear in mind the constraints of it's not as adaptable. You can't do all the things that you do in Visual Studio, and that, I would always point that out. Power BI, that's not the case, but for Power Apps, that's definitely something you need to be aware of, that it's not the all end all. It is very good for what it does, but you shouldn't ever rule out that you're going to need to build custom apps. Is there any questions on Power Apps before I move on to anything else? Okay. So, Flow. So if any of you ever built anything in Flow or LogicApps, yeah? So this is one of my favourite things that existed in Office 365, purely because I use it to automate all of my workload myself, so it can read my emails to help give me a push notification if my boss has emailed me, etc. But really, it's the kind of, Flow is the user version of LogicApps, so you don't have to have an Azure subscription to use Flow. It's built in a different way, it's by execution. But it's really, under the hood, a user-friendly version of BizTalk. The code underneath is very similar, but it is the same kind of messaging. It's not bulk data, so don't try and push heaps and heaps and heaps of records through Flow. But if you've got a kind of drip feeding data or transactional data, Flow is really good in that space. You can then build a Flow and export it to a LogicApp. So if you, so you're not in the people who have access to the Azure subscription and you don't have LogicApps and you can't do that. You can build everything, your proof of concept in Power BI, PowerApps, Flow, and then you can migrate a Flow to a LogicApp. You can just export it and then execute that in Azure. There is a price point where that makes sense. If you're doing 50,000 transactions with Flow, you might want to use a LogicApp, which is where I look at it. The really good part, and a demo at another event, is this is the best place to infuse AI cognitive services. And I think if any of you in this track earlier today, Dan did a demo of calling the cognitive services API within Flow. this is the best place to do it if you're trying to enrich your application with AI, because you don't repeatedly call potentially an expensive API. You'll call it once and you can control how many times it happens. So if you build a Power BI solution using cognitive services or machine learning, sorry. Every time you refresh it, it will do an API call on every single record. So if you've got 1 million records, you don't want to pay for that 1 million records every time somebody decides to push the refresh button. Whereas if you've used LogicApps, you can then store that in a data mart where it's there in perpetuous, and then you can just call that, whether you put it in Azure SQL and so on, and it's there. So you've only made that call once. Sorry, I'm going to have to get a glass of water. I can't.
I was going to be more discreet when they go.
Sorry?
There's only sparkling left, I'm afraid.
Oh, thank you. So the difference really between Flow and LogicApps, intrinsically they're the same thing, but they're aimed at different people. So Flow is the kind of self-serve power user, and LogicApps, there are some additional features. So you can edit the code in a LogicApp, whereas you can't in Flow. You can use it in Visual Studio. The security model is the bit that trips people up. Flow relies on Office 365, whereas a LogicApp is assuming you're using Azure security. So if you are going to export a Flow to a LogicApp, that's the bit to watch out for if you're doing anything to do with security based on it. So Flow can be used for all the things that you'd imagine BizTalk would be used for. I mentioned you shouldn't use it for a bulk data load, but it really comes into its own when you're doing something. Any of you guys use Dynamics Online or have looked at it? So this is really the same decision logic engine that's in Dynamics. So if you're going to build apps for Dynamics, for example, this is essentially the same logic and the same process you're going to go through. A Flow app is essentially the same as the process automation within Dynamics. And you can use a Flow to manipulate Dynamics. It's completely integrated into Dynamics already. So you might, for example, create a custom Dynamics solution, and then you have field service for that. So you create a Power App where the user needs to, I don't know, take a picture of a piece of equipment they've done maintenance on and say, I confirmed I've done maintenance on that. They can push submit in the Power App. The Flow then goes to updates the service part of Dynamics and says this job's been done, invoice the customer, and it's all automated, and you haven't had to write a custom integration, you haven't had to make a custom mobile app, and you're just using the default logic that you've built within Dynamics. When you couple PowerApps and Flow and Dynamics is where you get a real game changer if you've looked at using Dynamics. Or what I'm going to come on to next is the Common Data Service, which is really Dynamics without the UI layer. So it's the kind of entities of Dynamics with all the kind of integration with the rest of the Microsoft stack. But it's kind of database software as a service is the way I try and describe it to people. So you're not managing any backups, you're not managing any of the resources. Microsoft just allow you to create your own entities, use their pre-built entities. Pre-built entities are really good if you've just got a kind of account entity. And then if somebody's built a third-party application you want to bring in, and you've used the standard account entity, guess what? It's just going to work because they built on the same logic, on the same common data service. Of course, pretty much no one just uses a standard entity, and you can create your own custom entities within the common data service. The word of warning is do not use this to store heaps and heaps of data. So if any of you have looked at Dynamics, the real thing you've got to watch out for is storage cost. The common data service is a similar thing. It's not the cheapest thing to store data in, but if you then understand that maybe I don't need to have all the overhead of managing the support of that database underlying, then it can make sense. For me, the real game change for a common data service is it's already integrated with everything. And in my life, the time I spend most is on integration and authentication. It seems to eat up a good third of every time I do a project, and this just removes most of that pain away, which is the bit I really like as developing solutions. I think it was in the keynote, so it's not just Dynamics Office 365. There's also this common data initiative, so you'll see data sources from Adobe, from SAP, suddenly being exposed within this environment, so you can consume those, work with those in your common data service flow and so on. So Microsoft's doing a very good job of bringing all of this stuff into one easy accessible place for you. But right now it's really the kind of Dynamics 365 and the kind of pre-built entities they've done. Interestingly, Microsoft have already started creating pre-built entities for different industry verticals, so like healthcare, insurance and so forth. So if that makes sense for you, they've kind of already done some of that work for you. I would recommend exploring it. If any of you've got Office 365 Plan E3 or more, you've already got access to the common data service, just at a kind of lower level. So you can go and have a look, or you can look at the documentation. You can take the schema and just apply it to a database, and you can see what it would be like if you want to do it that way. Obviously the integration part doesn't work then, but I would really advise looking at, especially if you're looking at any kind of integration with Dynamics going forward. So all of these things can be really augmented with developing you can still extend them with your custom code. You can even build custom controls, connectors for PowerApps, and do all of the things that you do to create a kind of unique selling point or a competitive edge within your offering that you couldn't otherwise do. So the thing I find with doing in PowerBI is if I produce something in PowerBI with just the off-the-shelf components, if my competitor can see that and they're reasonably smart, they can work backwards and replicate what I've done if they can realize I've just used standard components. If what I've done is something a bit novel, so a custom component, some data manipulation that isn't obvious, it is much harder to try and rework and copy whatever application you've made. I mean, it's not a thing on machine learning, but if any of you've used cognitive services, the machine learning in Azure is exactly the same, applied exactly the same way if you were using one of those solutions. So you've gone and done your machine learning model, you've trained it, you've got a kind of, I don't know, sentiment analysis that's bespoke to your industry, or you've done some image recognition. You can just call that within Flow in exactly the same way when it's published in Azure, and then you can use that within your application. So for example, you could do a machine learning for that same maintenance app. You take a picture of the piece of equipment, you've done all the training of the thing, the images, that's what could happen to that equipment, and it can make a recommendation to the engineer. So that kind of scenario. So just within that Power App, you can deliver the AI through Flow or LogicApp back to that Power App to that user, and you haven't really had to make an individual application or do the authentication to enable that. Something that you can also do, so I don't know if any of you've seen any of the mapping stuff we've done today, but you can also bring mapping APIs, so Azure Maps, Bing Map APIs, Google Maps as well, any of those kind of APIs you can bring in there. So you could do a route optimization for a specific, I don't know, heavy load, for example, if you're doing trucking and you've got a big wide load and you need to use the Bing Map API to go, I can't go down this road because it's not wide enough. So there's a call for that. You could build a Power App that uses that. and then use the data that the PowerApp's recording, so it can use the GPS and so on of your phone, and you could analyze that within Power BI and give stats back without creating an entire application to do that. So I kind of gone at speed because I was hoping that maybe we can go back if there's any areas of interest, discussion, any questions on Power Platform.
Yeah, just going back to what you went over first with the premium offering.
Yes.
100 terabyte space.
Yes.
Is that for one database, or can you multi-tenant it and have lots of different BI customers
So
in your? So we as a company pay our £3,500 a month.
yes.
We have lots of customer databases, Power BI that we serve out on that.
If you're sharing, yes, essentially, you can have the separate data store by that. Obviously, when you say multi-tenanted, that's contained within one Microsoft tenant, if that was the question. So you can't.
Shared to multi-customer.
Yeah, so you could share. You can divide that workload out, and then share that whether you're going to use embedded or whether you're going to use Azure B2B to then.
I guess what I'm saying is, can you have multiple customers, each with embedded B2B applications that look at our one single 100 terabyte
Yes.
Power BI instance?
You'd have to be careful how you set it up, but yes.
Yeah.
It's in a kind of Azure B2B environment, it's really easy. When you're using embedded, it's a little bit more tricky.
Is it more tricky if the original data store is on premise as well?
No, if you're going to migrate, so if you do the push of data into the Power BI service, no, it's not. I mean, obviously, 100 terabytes will take a while, unless you have a very good internet connection. But the other part that I didn't put in this slide, I didn't think the storage question is going to come. You can then just link it to Azure Data Lake instead, if you wanted to, and use that method. So you can link.
Incremental refresh, is that all part of that?
So yes, that's part of Power BI Premium. You can't do that in Pro. So that's setting up the incremental refresh. Go, this is the source data set, this is my new data, append that to my existing data set. And I don't envisage that will happen anywhere in Pro.
Sorry, that incremental refresh, is that a refresh of your data model database? So you've taken your source and you've already extracted from it what you want to surface.
Yeah, so it's incrementally reloading the model, the reporting model.
From the main source?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, so the model loading is the time-consuming part because it's doing its compression and moving it all around. So really, if you've got up to a 10 gigabyte file, you want to be using incremental refresh. If you were looking in different approaches here without using Premium, Azure Analysis Services allows you to do incremental refresh on any SKU. So you could do it there. So for example, instead of having one Power BI Premium central thing where you manage it all in Premium, you could have an analysis services per customer if you wanted to segment it that way, or have multiple models within one analysis services. So you can have lots of models within one. Analysis services will really help you scale wide. Power BI Premium is really geared for going up. So if an individual customer is getting big, then Power BI Premium works. Analysis service goes up as well, but if you want to really go wide on your scaling, then you start to look at using analysis services currently.
the underlying configuration of that, are they interchangeable between analysis services and Power BI?
So currently, it's a one-way trip from Power BI to analysis services. There is a non-supported way of putting it back. I wouldn't do that with anything in production. It will gain, so I mean my personal feeling is analysis services will become part of Power BI in its entirety at some point, and then there'll be different SKU models to use within Power BI Premium. Because at the moment they have two divisions of Microsoft developing essentially the same technology on the same So you find that analysis services lags on some of the features of Power BI. So they've got X thousand more developers in Power BI than they have on Azure Analysis Services. So my feeling, I don't officially know, is analysis services will become part of Power BI Premium. Mainly because multi-dimensional, I think, will only be a legacy support now. I can't see it being supported anywhere else. Any other questions? No? So, how long have I got? Have I just overrun? Sorry? Or by a minute or two? Okay. So, what I would kind of sum up with for Power Platform is really, if you are going to use Office 365, Power BI, look at PowerApps. Does it solve any problems for you? And if it does, it is a really efficient way of solving those problems. Flow, use for your own automation is the best way of learning it. There's like 1 million YouTube videos of how to make your life better in Office 365 with Flow. And then if you then find that Flow you can then use with Dynamics, Common Data Service, or anything. It's got so many connectors, so there's like 1 million things you could try and think of to do with Flow. So a demo I do is you can just build your own Twitter sentiment analysis Power BI report, and it takes about 25 minutes. So if marketing will go, I want this, I want to monitor this hashtag, I want to see what our customers are saying about us. Of course you can buy all these applications, but you could just build something really quickly and go, I want to monitor that and I want to display it in this way. And you could do that. And that's something I've done internally, and it's kind of a use case. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you for your time. Please reach out if you want any help on this area. I mean, there's quite a lot of different products to cover, so 40 minutes doesn't really do them justice. You could spend a whole day, and really I just want to show you some demos, going into each one, showing an integrated app and so on and so forth. But if any of you guys want some more feedback on that, or we can run through some demos over Skype or something like that, I'm more than happy to do that.